Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the free live webinar brought to you by Mail and Guardian, of course, and it is on security and compliance evolution in the data revolution. And this webinar is in fact sponsored by Microsoft. Of course, in the 21st century, in the year 2020, we're very concerned with our security in the online space. Things have developed very quickly. People like myself who aren't on the cloud, or at least don't know that if they are on the cloud, probably would benefit from the discussion that's going to ensue. But just very quickly, just to tell you a little more about the presenters, of course, that you see in front of you. Now, my name is Gershwell Brooks. I'm the moderator for this particular webinar. And so I will be obviously bouncing between the two speakers and making sure that the conversation flows, also giving you an opportunity to ask your various questions. Now, on this platform, you will see that there's a chat function. That chat function enables you to ask questions, to pose comments, and I'll be referring to it every now and again. And then just below that, there's a poll. And I'm just quickly going to read out the poll for you, and I will be bouncing to and fro between it. On July the 1st, it should say 2020, the majority of PAPIA will come into operation with a 12-month grace period for organizations to comply. Is your organization prepared for GDPR and PAPIA? And the responses are 100% for sure, 80% readiness, 50% there, 30% planning completed, not at all. So all that you have to do is click on each one of those individual options, and I'll be referring back to, of course, that poll as we continue throughout the conversation. So just to tell you a little more about myself, I have been working in the media space for the last 9 years, writing for various online publications as well as print publications, and of course also doing a radio show with 702. And I've been very lucky enough to have written, I believe, 2 opinion pieces for the Mail and Guardian. So apt, I guess, that we find ourselves here today. So our 2 speakers, first I'll introduce you to Kelly Shalom, Cloud Essentials in-house legal advisor and compliance specialist. She is a qualified attorney with over 20 years professional experience. Kelly has been extensively involved in mapping Microsoft's governance control framework to various international standards. She has also developed an advanced yet very practical data privacy assessment, an advisory workshop, and a classification taxonomy workshop. The workshops are helping companies attain optimal compliance with data privacy related legislation, including the GDPR, using the relevant Microsoft technologies and settings. So of course, if you're one of those respondents on the poll, that will tell us that you either at 30% planning completed or 50% there, maybe you can benefit from one of those workshops. And then next is, of course, Chris Hathaway. He's a founding member of the managing director of the SourceSoft International Group and its subsidiaries, Cloud Essentials and Salient Discovery. He has an extensive background in content management, migration, archiving, e-discovery, and a focus on the complexities and risks arising from the governance and compliance obligations in highly regulated industries like financial services, law firms, and government institutions, more particularly within the realm of current cloud services space and modern collaboration platforms like Microsoft 365. So welcome to the webinar. I'm really looking forward to, of course, your inputs, hearing from our 2 speakers. And some of the issues that we will be covering, I'm not going to go through all of them, is obviously overview and position of the data revolution due to the explosion of big data, risk profile of current ecosystem compliance data, security and protection measures, and cyber defense strategies. And all of these are extremely important in an age where our lives have become more online than ever before, taking into account that we're dealing with a global pandemic in the form of COVID-19. So a lot of us had to accelerate, our life on an online platform, and how secure and how safe are we ultimately? And I think these are some of the important questions that we will be canvassing today. Good afternoon to both our speakers. Great to have you with us, Kelly, as well as Chris. And Kelly, I will immediately hand over to you to kick us off around what are some of the key issues that we will be addressing, especially within the framing of the COVID-19 world that we live in, where all of us are suddenly living online.
Thanks, Ashol. Yes, obviously you mentioned the data revolution. There's an immense volume and complexity of data being generated and processed in current times. And there's also an endless application or types of application of that data in our day-to-day lives. So data is being collected and processed and stored in so many areas of our lives and devices that we use on a daily basis, from everything from our smartphones, our tablets, our televisions, our smartwatches, and even the license scanners that you come across at security checkpoints. Now, if you add to the fact that many of that data is so personal, everything from our identities, our preferences, our location, our photographs, our personal and financial information, even our fingerprints for biometric access, we can only begin to fathom the potential fallout from that data landing in the wrong hands. And every day, individuals entrust organizations with their data. They often click the I agree checkbox at the terms and conditions without reading those terms and conditions. They don't know the risk or don't appreciate the risk involved in actually, handing over their data. Identity theft is becoming and has become a very big problem. So even something as seemingly benign as your name and identity number can be used to obtain credit or mortgages or, anything along those lines. And social media obviously has a very important role to play. It is an extremely fertile dumping ground for people and their personal information, even sensitive personal information like health information or their political views get broadcast across a platform that has very unrestricted settings in most cases. And people are just not realizing what the risk and the danger is around that. From a company perspective, if you look at some of the data that's being generated and stored and processed within organizations, particularly one of the departments that we traditionally highlight is the Human Resources Department, they can have some very sensitive personal information, such as your name and your ID number, but also your photograph and your fingerprints for biometric access. Or in this time of COVID-19, they could have medical information around if you have tested positive for COVID-19, you could have a medical certificate that you've submitted to your organization, and this is information that gets stored. Now, medical information is regarded as highly sensitive. It is a special category in terms of GDPR and POPIA, and it requires extra measures to protect and extra ensuring that it is kept confidential. But it's not only personal data, it's also company information that is, if allowed to be released into the public domain or in the wrong hands, could actually prove to be very detrimental to the organization. And this can be anything from the company's trade secrets to their corporate strategies, their secret recipes, their designs, financial information. And one that's not commonly thought of is board minutes. I mean, minutes record discussions at a board level that you definitely don't want public from an organization's perspective. And just one of the differences that people need to bear in mind between GDPR and POPIA is that POPIA, whereas GDPR only mandates protection of personal information pertaining to a natural person, POPIA requires that you protect information pertaining to identifiable legal or juristic people. So this could be a company, for example, is a legal person. So the importance of protecting the company's data becomes that much more, critical. And then we're also seeing a lot of decentralized processing of data. So whereas traditionally data was stored, processed on central servers, they were located on premises, which were kept in locked cages, and then logical access controls and physical access controls were restricted. Now you've got people accessing data on mobile devices, and in sort of online on the internet using cloud storage platforms like Google Drive and Dropbox. And so that as you decentralize the processing of that data, so you decentralize the organization's control. And then just adding to the big data revolution and the change in risk that we're seeing because of it is the increased connectivity. Now, if you think about it, I mean, traditionally we would connect to a modem and a telephone line. Now you've got mobile hotspots. You can connect via your cell phone. You can connect to publicly available Wi-Fi that is 9 times out of 10 not secure. And you're transferring, if you're accessing your company's cloud platform using a public network, you're transferring data that is sensitive and critical in a non-secure way. So these are all the factors that have contributed to this new risk environment that we're currently looking at.
I mean, that for me is absolutely fascinating. I mean, taking into consideration, this is something that I think the vast majority of people watching this discussion would admit to, is that all too often you come across the terms and the conditions. It's basically longer than most theses. And you just click on agree and move ahead, and you don't know what you've agreed to. All too often, I'm very shocked that I would be looking for something that I want to purchase, something I might just be interested in. And I open one of my social media pages, and lo and behold, there I find everything that I've been looking for. Special deals on it, more information, pages I might like on the particular issue, etc., etc. And it sticks around for quite some time. Chris, turning over to you. I mean, you know, Kelly painted a beautiful picture in setting the tone for, you know, what this conversation deals with, and not just in terms of natural persons, but also for corporations. And it's something that we need to really think about, because, you know, there's a lot of information that we just sort of automatically place into, you know, that we just place online, that we're happy to hand over ourselves even. Voluntarily, but at the same time, there's a major risk that you're running in putting all that information in what could be an unsecure space.
Yeah, I mean, I think, thanks, Kashua. I think you're right, and I think bringing it back to what you mentioned earlier, and, you know, COVID has not only been, you know, the end user that's been affected, but organizations have, in many cases, had to adopt cloud platforms because they need to provide working. They need to keep, you know, keep communications going, and often they may not have been completely ready for the policies, processes, and security features that needed to be in place in order to adopt that cloud strategies, but forced to adopt the cloud strategies in order to keep their businesses functioning and running appropriately. And I think what, you know, what we would normally do, and you're not under that kind of pressure, is you establish this external perimeter, because you're not protected by the internal network anymore. You know, the network is actually what we call now the endpoint, and the endpoint could be everywhere, and the data therefore is shared widely and could be anywhere. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and I think that what people have needed to do is really look at the ecosystem from both the security and information governance perspective, because a lot of the cloud platforms, Office 365 by Microsoft and some of the others, they actually have quite a lot of built-in governance and compliance elements in place. So you are able to, you know, my background is more originally advisory, but then moving more towards the technology. And Kelly will tell you, we spend a lot of our time getting the internal risk and control teams to speak to IT, because IT is really where you now need to give these things teeth. So whether it's the way you look after identity and manage who can access when and how, you know, that's going to protect you from not only the cyber risks, but also who and what's happening with your intellectual capital and your information within these platforms. So information protection. So there's this real convergence of security and governance, and you really need to be looking for an ecosystem that doesn't just provide the sort of wheels and spanners of being able to send email store information, it should also allow you to centralize and simplify the management and the control elements of the platform. So, you really need to be able to, if you have a security policy, if you have an information governance policy, you really need to be able to give it teeth through the technology, because the reality is people have never really been that good at just following a corporate policy. It's a critical part. I think that education is, one of the starting blocks, but, if you can really back that up with some technology that'll give it teeth, that's going to help a lot. And I think going back to the COVID piece, the other advantage is you can take advantage of these things quite quickly. So by giving a lot of that responsibility to cloud service providers, in our case, we work a lot with the Microsoft cloud service provider, but by being able to hand the responsibilities for some of the layers over to the cloud, that has allowed people to deploy faster, which has allowed them to react to something like COVID a lot quicker. So now they are in a situation where, it's not only the actual functional pieces, but also being able to get some of that governance and compliance. And this is really where Kelly and I spend a lot of time with our customers, is talking through and working out what we call the shared responsibility model, as to where you take responsibility, where your cloud service provider takes responsibility. Very important. Make sure you trust your cloud service provider. Make sure you've researched that provider. And you continue to research and judge that provider on their performance, because trust is key if you're going to be handing over some of these responsibilities to in a software as a service, particularly where you really are giving them a lot of the elements of control. You need to be able to that provider. But it does allow you to modernize that infrastructure very quickly, and then also establish what we call a modern perimeter, which is this, people accessing from mobile devices, people accessing now remotely more than in the office. You really need to be able to establish that modern perimeter so that you don't land up with what we call the shadow IT conundrum, which is, people start using Dropbox personal, but for work requirements. They start using Skype consumer, or they start using other systems that are not that don't necessarily conform to to the information governance policies and the security policies of the business itself.
Well, just to let you know, I see that the poll is moving on a regular basis, which means that people are actually participating in the poll, and the results are quite interesting thus far. Just to quickly repeat the poll, in case you've just joined us. On the 1st of July, 2020, the majority of POPIA will come into operation with a 12-month grace period for organizations to comply. Is your organization prepared for the GDPR and POPIA? 7%, it keeps on changing. I told you 6% of you saying 100% for sure. I'll do it again, because it literally keeps on changing real time. It just jumped from 6% to 10%. So keep on voting, and that way I don't sound like an auctioneer when I get back to the poll results. But I will do that. I see that you're also posting your questions. I'll post those, or I'll pose those to the two speakers as well. But Kelly, just to come back to you, I mean, Chris touched on something that's very important, and this is ultimately the notion of trust. And I guess trust comes from the idea that we obviously have a broad spectrum of participants, people watching this conversation and listening in on this conversation right now, all the way from the small business owner that's not just, slash CEO, a major shareholder, et cetera, but basically the IT person for said organization as well, all the way through to major corporations and businesses where you have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. But ultimately, you still need trust for you to be able to understand complexities around the GDPR as well as POPIA. And it's amazing that within 2 days, literally, POPIA is going to partially come into effect, giving people 12 months grace period. Now, 12 months sounds like a lot, but I'm sure that there's a lot of work that you have to do within that period of 12 months. And that's why we're asking, how far are you with your planning and basically being ready for that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I smiled because I was looking at the poll stats as well, and I see 25% First, I'm not even going to talk about the 6% who think they're 100% there, because I don't believe that there is such thing as 100% there. Compliance is very much a journey rather than a destination. And as risks evolve, so the compliance response must evolve. The word compliant will always be preceded by the word optimally. I will never say to clients, oh, you're now 100% compliant, because I don't believe that that is a reality. You can be as optimally compliant as you can until the next risk arises. And I think that's something that the two laws, the GDPR and POPIA both, really keep in mind, because there needs to be ongoing assessment of risk. They both mandate a risk-based approach, which means that the organization needs to have a look at what risks face their organization, rate them in terms of severity and extent, and based on those ratings, implement their controls accordingly. So, what I was saying at the beginning of this, I said the 80%, the 25% of people who think they're 80% ready, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they have done some sort of assessment, because most of the customers that we find, whether it is a smaller organization that's going to face very different risks to a very big corporate, they don't actually know where they are on the journey. And if you don't know where you are on the journey, you actually don't know which direction to take or where to start. So, I mean, one of the services we do offer is this assessment and advisory workshop, where we actually have a look. There are a list of questions pertaining to data privacy. We have a look and see, well, what are the areas you are doing well at, and what are the areas that do require extra work? And then we look at the people, process, and technology controls that you need to implement to meet those requirements. And, as Chris said, the people and process is as important as the technology. Yes, the technology has become a lot more advanced and a lot more extensive at mitigating risk. But the fundamentals of people and process still remain as relevant today as they did pre the technology era. So you have your information security policy, your data privacy policy, and a host of other policies, depending on the size of the organization and the volume of data that they traditionally process and the type of data that they process. And then you've got to have your key people. So you've got to have your data privacy officer or your data protection officer. In terms of POPIA, it's called an information officer. It's the same individual that's required in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act. And then what you want is, depending on the size of the organization, and we really don't like to enforce a one-size-fits-all for each, because businesses are different, industries are different, data is different. So we really, when we do work with customers, we make it as bespoke to their specific needs and their specific industries as possible. But if you do have a big organization with a lot of departments, typically a multinational organization, you want something called a data champion. That's somebody at the service level in the organization, in the various departments, and they are responsible for promoting good data privacy practices. And they're usually the first contact point between someone in that division who might have a data privacy concern and the data protection officer, who's usually at head office, high up, and not always as accessible. So those data privacy champions are, if you do have a big organization that's very disparate, they're a very good tool from a people perspective to keep that going. But I mean, we talk about culture and people generally, and you were talking about trust. It's so key, and this is something that I preach to whoever will listen. It is so key that companies create an awareness of data privacy. Not that it's, it mustn't be advanced or very technical that only people in IT can understand. It needs to be as basic as your lowest level of employee that has access to that data. And it's not just a one-stop training. I have customers say to me all the time, we do orientation where, employees get trained on this. That's not good enough. You need a consistent communication on the importance of data privacy, on the importance of the role that each employee plays in that, and basically on the consequences of them not complying, and thereby, creating this culture and creating this awareness of data privacy and the importance of it. And that really forms the foundation and the basis of a good data privacy compliance program is that awareness and that approach.
Kelly, if I
have a quick. Oh, sorry. Continue, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just bringing it a little bit back to the poll and in that discussion, I know it's something we see a lot between the two of us. You've got that people, process, and technology layer. Often there may have been a lot of work done in the process side or the people side, but the technology layer hasn't been brought in. So when you look at this poll and I look at the way people are answering it, have you actually had those three people and the significant people in those three areas in the same room talking about this? And have you been able to give you card against all those elements? So it's the people, it's the process, and the technology, and how well integrated are they? Because in this day and age, they have to be integrated. And have you been able to score? So often what we find is we can actually add some value by giving them a scorecard as to where they are right now. Right, you're very advanced with people and process, and you've got the technology, but the people in that technology division or section or who run that application have never spoken to the chief data officer. That's just never going to get you where you need to get to.
Yeah.
I've a couple of questions that have come through. Kelly, I'm going to direct the first one to you because I think it spoke specifically directly to the issues related to POPIA. It comes from Laureen Burton. Now, what she's asking is, in the context of increasing governance compliance that is required for boards, what would be the key points to look at or look out for in seeking to comply with POPIA?
I think, look, obviously, the substantive provisions of POPIA, the fact that you need to implement organizational and technological measures to protect data. So that forms the cornerstone of any compliance or governance program. Just to remember that, and the organizational is what we were talking about from a people process perspective, and then the technology from that perspective. But, I think what's key is always approach it from a risk-based approach. So really do the exercise of identifying what the risks are, rating those risks, and then determining what controls best mitigate those risks. And we do say to companies, don't over mitigate, because what that's going to happen is it's going to actually lead to no productivity, because employees are going to feel very stifled by all the additional controls that actually are not giving much of a benefit. And just another thing to bear in mind that GDPR and POPI also talk about is that you need to consider the cost of implementation of those controls. So it is very much a cost-benefit analysis as well. So, for example, if there is a small organization that the cost of implementing a particular license or a particular software is too excessive for their budget, then they're not expected to implement it. It's a risk-based approach. It's a cost-benefit analysis. And I think those are the major takeaways from this data protection legislation. I hope I've answered your question.
No, thanks for that. And then I have one for Chris from Erica Lawrence asking, with the current pandemic, the new norm is meetings via Zoom, Skype, and other platforms. How safe is it really, as this is the only current medium? And I think that's a very fair question, taking into account that certain state institutions have been, at the very minimum, horrifically embarrassed using some of these platforms where people have literally crashed or gate crashed these meetings, uploaded offensive content, troubling content for some, and derailed the whole meeting and the whole idea behind it. So of course, I have a 5-year-old that's on Zoom every single day for school purposes as well. And I promise you, I do check in every now and again just to make sure that someone didn't gate crash their Zoom meetings. So how safe are these platforms that we're using because of the circumstances that we're living under due to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, and this is back to the two things this comes back to, and the first is trust. Do you trust the service provider? If you're going to use a cloud-based platform like a Zoom, like a Microsoft's, like Google, any of them, you need to start off by trusting that provider and having done your own research. You need to find the trust center for the provider that you're working with. You need to interrogate. Sometimes that is part of the process with the information governance team. Before they allow a business to deploy a new technology, that's part of the tick box exercise that you need to get through. Then you need to ensure that you've deployed that technology properly, and that if you're going to use that technology within your organization, that you have the controls that are available in place. I guess we're definitely a bit biased in that we work with Microsoft a lot. If you adopt a Microsoft ecosystem, where all of these things are an ecosystem, when you put the processes and policies and the technology in place to control external sharing, label information and classify information using automated classification policies, it will then extend through into things like the video conferencing. So it won't matter whether you're sharing the document through collaboration, you're emailing the document, or you're actually sharing the document in a live meeting like we're on today. You need to have a system in place, an ecosystem in place that's going to protect your users regardless of the way they're connecting to and this is exactly it, to shadow IT. You don't want shadow IT. You want to make sure that from a business organization, they've got the facilities they need to work efficiently, but you don't just want a free-for-all where people are deploying, because sometimes it's not the technology's fault either. If you've left the technology open, you haven't deployed it properly, you haven't chosen the security and information tools properly that are at your disposal within that technology, you can't blame the technology for that. Sometimes it is the technology's problem. Particularly sometimes the technology got very big very quickly and probably hadn't had the chance to mature. And then, of course, that goes back to picking your vendors. Rather pick a safe list of vendors to use that you've researched. And then, you might be missing out on a few whistles and bells, or you may be getting a whole ecosystem of control where you've got signals that are being centralized. So that doesn't matter if you're in risk or if you're in information security, the signals, the security, and the way your intellectual capital is being protected is centralized, easy to reach, and easy to govern from, regardless of which division you're in.
Fascinating. Thank you for that one. Another very important question. I'm directing this one to you, Kelly, from one Liu, who asks, who is responsible for PPIA compliance? If a company, sorry, I'm just trying to find it again. If companies do not have an in-house legal or compliance officer, does this fall under the IT manager's function? It's a very important question because I can't think of a single organization that has a straightforward answer for that question.
Okay, so it's quite simple. You don't have to appoint a new person to be in that role. I'm not sure I would I would strongly recommend against having somebody in the technology sort of area. And this is what Chris was talking about earlier, and is something I speak about so often, is we're seeing a conflation or a union of technology and compliance under GDPR, under POPIA, that we have not seen before. So I mentioned that the laws require you to implement organizational and technological measures to protect data. They also require that when you design your systems, that those systems be compliant at design and at the time when they process the data. So you have the technology side of things, but as important as that technology is, so the compliance side is as well. And you would definitely need, also based on the fact that, I spoke about a risk-based approach, you can't have somebody who is solely technology-minded and technology-driven being that information officer. That's just not something I would recommend. One of the things that we're seeing increasingly, which is problematic and we're trying to curb, is IT departments within organizations using the compliance technology, like Chris mentioned, classification and labeling, or retention labels, for example, which is a very good example, because they are now implementing retention labels, but they don't know what the regulations or the legislation requires of you in terms of retaining that data. So they are now just implementing retention labels, possibly with disposition at the end, which means that once the retention period is up, the document then deletes, and they could land up deleting documents which you require to keep in terms of legislation, just because they don't understand the laws or the regulatory requirements. So if a customer asked me, would I be comfortable with someone in IT being the information officer? I'd have to say absolutely no. There must be some level of governance or legal or something within most organizations where that person can act.
Yeah,
for sure.
Kelly, if I could add to that, I mean, we see this situation because sometimes IT gets frustrated because business hasn't got back to them with things like retention. It's hard to give both the general and specific retention policies. There's a lot of work to be done. The technology in the cloud is quick to switch on, but what are you switching on? You can't have the tail wagging the dog. You can't have IT turning these things on if the business hasn't told them what retention and disposition policy should be in place. Now, that's a big decision which may go down to various parts of the business. There needs to be an information officer needs to own that. It needs to own that. IT generally doesn't want to own this, but out of desperation and because of the lack of any other information, we do often find that these things are being run by IT. And I guess it's IT trying to provide the business with value and trying to do, but in both things, if you haven't spoken to business and if business hasn't spoken to IT, they're going to get it right. So I guess the takeaway is make sure that you really have both role players, because where the rubber hits the road, it's IT that needs to make it happen. But IT can't decide on what the rules and the reasons behind that are. So, I guess it's just that sort of horses for courses approach, making sure there's communication between those two.
Very important point that you're raising there. I mean, that takes me to, and it's a very broad notion that we're discussing. And Chris, I hope you don't mind if we start with you. The challenges, benefits, and best practices for business. I think, maybe it's looking for a microwave solution. I hope that's not what I'm promoting, but the whole idea that people want something simple, straightforward that they can understand. So what are some of those that we are talking about in terms of challenges, benefits, and best practices for business when we're talking about this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another good point. Pre-cloud days, pre-cloud service providers.
I think we've lost Chris.
I think if you guys are hearing me, but so I think that what's happened is cloud platforms have allowed organizations to really take advantage of being able to just switch things on without having to deploy infrastructure, spend a whole lot of money training different parts of the IT team to be able to run and manage these platforms in the background. A lot of these things can be switched on with a click of a button now. So that part of it, those challenges have been taken away. So I think leveraging the licensing you've bought and making sure that you've got the security and governance controls which have shipped with. And often I find customers have spent a fortune on cloud licensing and they're not even aware of the governance and security elements that are available to them. These things have been super well designed. They've been tested on thousands of large and small corporates. There are very few requirements in a good cloud platform today that aren't available to you. Yes, you may need a little bit more licensing, and of course they do, just like anyone else, they're going to want you to buy some more licensing. But one of the things we do a lot is to make sure that we've looked at the licensing you've got, so that one, that you're using everything you're paying for. Because as with often the case, people buy a whole lot of technology and they're not, making full use of it. And then two, if there are gaps in your specific vertical or your specific industry, then, we need to tell you, look, you're going to need some more licensing, more technology on the roadmap to meet this requirement, going back to more Kelly's kind of risk-based approach to it. But yes, make sure, if you're still largely on site, it's very difficult to keep up. You would need to be deploying lots of different vendors, technologies, lots of different pieces of equipment and infrastructure to run the same ecosystem that you can just subscribe to. And then it's not your problem. It's the cloud service provider. Platforms like Microsoft Office 365 or Microsoft 365 are hugely developed and advanced with their governance features and their security. There are more governance and security features than there are the base platforms. People think a cloud platform is like mail and sharing of documents, but it's also the glue that keeps all of that together with the governance and compliance and security elements, which is just as important.
No, valuable insights there. Anything you want to add to it, Kelly?
One of the things that I think is going to be a challenge, always is a challenge, and it's something I alluded to earlier, was ensuring that all the available compliance technologies that you are going to use does not interrupt workflow or productivity. As I said, if employees are feeling stifled by all the controls, then at best they're not going to cooperate, and at worst they'll actually look for workarounds. So I think it's important, as I said, it's important for companies not to over mitigate. The other issue that I think is very pertinent in the COVID-19 era is the issue of access control. We're obviously in very uncharted territory here, but I do believe that access control is going to be a big risk for companies from the perspective of, for example, replacement employees. If you have a staff member, you have several staff members that are down for COVID, they're absent from work, whether they're working remotely, and you've had to put replacement employees, you will give them access to the correct employees' resources, but when the roles get swapped around again, that access doesn't get revoked in time. So that's a risk, albeit maybe a small risk. The bigger risk for an organization from the perspective of access control is retrenchments. A lot of organizations are embarking on mass retrenchments at the moment. And because there's so much mobility of platforms like Microsoft 365, where people can access it from any device, then their cell phones, their iPads, whatever. If their access to the system is not immediately revoked, then you have the risk of them accessing potentially very valuable information that could be sold to willing participants to make some extra money. And the issue as well around collaborative, I think Chris also mentioned this earlier. If you are on collaborative platforms like Microsoft Teams, and your permissions and your access levels are not nailed down, there is the risk that, because you can share internally and externally, so there is the risk that confidential company or business information can be disclosed inadvertently or intentionally. And I feel that access control is going to be a challenge for companies in this COVID era. And they need to just be cognizant of, they need to have the processes in place. For most companies do, when employees leave, they do have an access revocation process, but they just need to be aware of what is going on, of who has access, what permissions they have, and so on and so forth.
So I'm looking at the time. We have about 16 minutes left in each other's company for this webinar. So just a quick reminder that if you have any questions, please do post them in the chat function. There's, of course, also the poll, and I think the poll has settled a bit. It looks less like the stock market at midday. I think I'll be able to go through the poll. So just to remind you very quickly, the poll that we're running throughout the conversation is on the 1st of July 2020, the majority of POPIA will come into operation with a 12-month grace period for organizations to comply. Is your organization prepared for the GDPR and for PIA? Now, 100%, those of you, 12% of you say that you're 100% for sure. 80% readiness is at 25%. 50% there is at 27%. 30% planning and completed is at 17%, and not at all at another 17%. No bets on who is the most honest when we take that breakdown of the 100%. But I mean, coming back to the main issues that we are discussing at this point in time, and this is perhaps a bit of a silly question on my side, but I think a question that's burning nonetheless. And this is the notion of implementing intelligent compliance and risk management solutions. We live, as I said, we live in a society where we're looking for microwave solutions, quick, fast solutions. And all too often, someone comes along and says to you that, you know what, we can provide you with an automated, smart solution for this particular problem. Does such a thing exist, or is it a case of you need to buckle down and you need to understand the ecosystem that you're operating within?
I'm going to take this one. There's, as I said earlier, there's no standard template for, well, if every organization follows this, they're going to be optimally compliant. There's just no such thing. It's very dependent on what risks your organization operates, what industry they operate. For example, big pharma, they may have personal and medical information pertaining to drug trial candidates, just as a random example. So it's very industry dependent, it's very risk dependent. It's what sort of data are you processing, are you collecting? But, you know, Microsoft's approach to this has been based on 4 themes, which is an approach that we've adopted, and that's the discover, manage, protect, and report. So discover really talks to, do you know what data you have and where it's located? Are you able to classify that data? And it's actually interesting, I was reading recently that the whole notion of data classification came from the military and from government intelligence agencies, where they classified documents based on level of access. So what's happened now is data classification has basically incorporated the same objectives and the same principles. They're just applying it. It's no longer a rubber stamp across a document. It's now a metadata label that travels with the document. But so there's the discovery phase. Then there's manage, which is how you are actually managing the data that you're processing. And this is everything from responding to your data subject requests. For example, their request to access their data, their request to have their data erased. And also it looks at what legal basis you have for processing, because POPIA and GDPR list a certain list of legal grounds that you are entitled to process personal information. Protect will cover everything from encryption, for example, as a protection mechanism, breach detection and response, and then report looks at maintaining of records of processing. So do you have documentary evidence to demonstrate your compliance with the regulations, with the laws? So those sort of 4 themes pervade most data privacy, governance, and compliance programs. Most things will fall under one of those 4 headings. And I think if you follow that, that is a sound approach. If you follow that approach to data protection, data privacy, compliance, it is as a high-level framework, it is the best way to probably go. But it allows for flexibility for the organization, for the industry, for the kind of data that they process, but it just provides that sort of framework. And one of the nice things is, just going back to what I said earlier about that compliance is a journey rather than a destination. Microsoft have got what they call their compliance manager, which is an online portal that allows organizations to manage their compliance journey. It allows you to upload documents of implementation. If you have used third parties to audit your systems, the third-party results reports can get uploaded. You can put in details of the implementation. You can allocate responsibility for implementation. So that a tool like that is actually invaluable to actually manage the compliance journey. And they have mapped their own control framework, because as Chris was talking earlier about a shared responsibility model. For example, back in the day, physical access controls were the company's responsibility. Now, Microsoft has implemented very stringent controls at their data centers. So they take care of the physical access control issue. So there are a number of standards, international standards and regulations that Microsoft has complied with, and all of their control mapping and their implementation is in that tool. So you can see what they're doing. They're very transparent about that. You can see what they're doing, and they make recommendations for what you can do to improve your compliance.
And Kelly, what I like about that is that's that part of, making sure you trust your vendor. Make sure you've looked at the standards and compliance, the levels of compliance your service provider has reached. It's useful for the decision on the technologies, the technologies you take. Maybe one other quick area that I'd love to talk about, just because I think it's quite exciting from my perspective, is the way the larger service providers or cloud service providers are starting to use machine learning to do a whole bunch of things, all the way from being able to do anomalous behavior detection. Like, this looks odd. Why is this person downloading or sharing so many files in such a short period of time? Why is somebody logging in South Africa and then 2 hours later logging in London? That can't be right. I'm going to block access. But more on the more to the information and knowledge management side, the part that really excites me is more and more, once you've done the groundwork, like, people think this AI thing is going to do your job for you. AI ain't ever going to do your job, well, not in my lifetime, for you. You need to do the groundwork. You need to put in the hard yards. But once you've done that, you can start using machine learning to help you classify information, to help you declare records on a file plan. Even more excitingly, help you see the correlation and the connection between different pieces of information that you wouldn't previously have seen. So being able to say, hey, I need a knowledge expert. Show me a knowledge expert in this field. And it'll be able to say, well, hang on, this person's generated thousands of documents in this field. Hey, and here's a link to all the documents you have access to in that this person has generated. Being able to traverse knowledge and information, and also be able to have it automatically, because the reality is, I don't think we're going to be able to keep up manually with the classification of this information. So if you don't have a way of automatically classifying as content is being generated, you're also not going to keep up. And it would be very hard to do that, because these cloud platforms have got thousands of users and hundreds of thousands of users and enterprises using their platforms. They're able to spend this sort of money to develop these tools, and it's crazy not to be taking advantage of them.
I have an interesting question here that I thought that we can just address just before we give you an opportunity to make your final comments. And this is from Maleho MD Nkomo, asking, public sector entities are not comfortable in going the cloud data storage route. What are the key things to take into account when procuring the services from a private cloud service provider? Just in brief there, I think it's an important one, especially where there seems to be some resistance in adopting some of these technologies.
Kelly, I'll take that at first, and then you can maybe take it after me. You'll come with, I think, more of the legal stance on that. But so I think more nations and institutions are starting to trust cloud, and to me, this is a trust issue. It is traditional and probably correct that government institutions are slower to adopt these things until trust has been established. Again, research needs to be done, but in many respects, I would have to say that the public cloud service providers may offer a lot more information security and governance options than the private providers, purely because the private cloud providers just don't have the sort of momentum and money and if you think about huge platforms like Microsoft and Google, they also can't afford breaches. They have massive security teams listening for signals. When they are scanning for viruses, malware, they're scanning across their online gaming platforms like it's Outlook.com, it's Hotmail, it's the entire corporate world that uses something like Office 365. All of those signals are being centralized into one security center. And that is huge. The advantages of that are where, if you've got a private cloud service provider, they just don't have the same reach to the kind of signals that are out there. Yes, there is the noisy neighbor issue potentially you need to look at. So does the public provider scale? But from my perspective, I think in many respects, government organizations may actually be better off in an advanced, trusted cloud. They certainly, however, worse off in a non-trusted cloud. So one that isn't been properly vetted is definitely even more dangerous because remember, the perimeter's gone. There's a perimeter with a private cloud provider. You're kind of going back to the old days of the network perimeter. But in this day and age, as we've seen with mobile devices and mobile phones, we now talk about endpoint protection. Because so much data is being shared in so many places, we now see an identity, i.e. the person that you log in as, the device you use. All of these things are just endpoints. You and your machine, you're an endpoint that needs to be managed. And I think that's really important from a cloud trust perspective, is if you go with a non-public cloud, can you still protect the endpoint, would be what I would say. I don't know if Kelly, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you've adequately nailed it. Just the one point from a Microsoft perspective that they do tend to make is they say like a lot of this governance and compliance technology has been born out of their own need to comply and their own need to meet ISO 27001 and NIST 53. And because of that need to comply, they have implemented such an extensive control network and control framework. And I mean, I work with that every single day, so I know what they've done. But yeah, Chris is absolutely right. You need to do your research. I mean, you are potentially entrusting very sensitive data to a cloud provider. You wouldn't give your banker, your account number and your PIN to somebody on the street. You want to know that it's hashed, that it's protected. And the same is true of your data. You've got to give it to somebody that you do trust, and not just a sake of blind trust. It's a case of you need to do your research and make sure that their controls are implemented and that they have compliance and privacy and data protection at the very center of their strategy.
It raises an exceptionally important question, especially around liability, because the one key thing that I kept on thinking throughout both of your contributions is, if something does go wrong, you go back to your data provider and say, guys, you weren't up to scratch? Or is it, for example, your base, your client base, or whoever may be the case, that can turn around and say, no, we entrusted our data with you. As for who you went to entrust that data with in turn, is none of our endeavor, so to speak. But as all good things do come to an end. So very quickly, if both of you, each one of you, can give me 30 seconds in just concluding remarks, because we'll have to end the conversation soon. Kelly, I'll start with you again.
I want people to realize that even though there is a lot of risk out there, there's new regulations, there's new legislation, that it is manageable, and that a reasonable response, a reasonable concerted response is all that's actually required. So just do your risk assessments, have a look at the risk to your business, and do the cost benefit analysis, and then you should be fine.
Chris, on your side?
Yeah, on my side, I'd just like to reiterate, get the people, process, and technology side of everything of your business talking to each other. In some cases, that may be fewer people. In some cases, it may be more people. But I really feel it is very difficult to respond unless you've done that. And I do also feel if you're not taking advantage of the technology, eventually, well, technology shouldn't be the lead thing, but it is the thing that brings the whip. It is the thing that drives home what you can and can't do. So yeah, as a parting, I would say just talk to business and to risk, and that information and that communication is flowing.
Excellent stuff, guys. Listen, thank you to everyone who obviously attended this webinar. It was exceptionally informative. I've learned a lot. I think both speakers would admit to the fact that from the onset of the conversation, I admitted to the fact that I didn't know much. I know a lot more now. I wouldn't say that I'm at 100%. I would say I'm at about 50% or thereabouts at least, but definitely learned a lot this afternoon. Of course, just to alert you to the fact that there is an offers section, so please go have a look at that. We'll direct you to a couple of links. There's links that have been posted throughout the course of the chat. And of course, this conversation will be available for you to go and watch again or listen to again on the Mail and Guardian's website. So go to mg.co.za/webinars. And that's where you can find out more information about the up and coming webinars that the Mail and Guardian will be hosting, as well as all of the other events, the current ones as well as the up and coming ones. It was absolutely wonderful being in your company. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Chris. All the best. And I'm pretty sure people are in.
Thanks, Gashua.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Gashua. Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Cheers.